Hello, humans. Can we set them up on iPads on sticks next time with little motors so they can drive around? This is an exotic community reference from the sixth season, which doomed Yahoo TV. So actually pretty good. Yeah, actually one of the great seasons of TV.
First three seasons were so good. So good.
Then there's the gas leak. Yeah. Well, they got rid of Dan Harmon. Sony said no. And then they brought him back, though. Yeah, but yeah, I know. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something completely different for a little while. And I'll give you the reason for it, but it's the Teletherm. So this is the on average coldest and warmest days of the year, which is upon us. I know I sort of alluded to it, but this is a funny little tweet to start with. This is a terrible moment in Wordle. This was yesterday, and if you do Wordle, you might know this was light. Light was the answer. Light. So I don't know what they put, but they got straight away. They got right or something, and then there's might, bite, geography, sight. But the line is great. The worst thing that has ever happened. The New York Times just bought Wordle. Did you see this? They bought it, and they claim it's gonna be free still, but it's part of the questionable character that is Will Shortz's like big puzzle grift that goes on. So
how long until the fad is over, though, right? Like
I know.
Like 3 weeks and they peak.
It's an interesting question because it's definitely had a fad takeoff, right? Like the big spread.
Nobody knew anything about it like 2 weeks ago.
Right. It's just for fun. So it's got a fantastic organic story though. So that's a bit of a difference. It wasn't pushed on us by big puzzle, right?
Something called Absurdal, and it's
Absurdal's excellent.
yeah, it's like an antagonistic.
It escapes from you, right? Like whatever you choose, it goes to the biggest pool of possible words that remain. Because it doesn't have a fixed answer. It's actually just so you're hunting it into a corner basically, and eventually it's yeah, yeah. Abswordle, I guess is the. That's actually quite fun to play. Yeah, because you have to sort of like coax it. If you guess X's and Y's and things like that, then it moves towards. It gives it bigger spaces. Anyway. I know, right? So you've got the mocking, the gifs, the jokes, like that'll have all of that stuff, which is fame. How fame's got to work, right? Eventually, there's got to be parodies. That's all done. Like feels like weeks ago.
Yeah.
Like Wordle art. Anyway, yeah. One that no one else knows about. I mean, there's the games that people play in their families that no one knows about. It's like this is very obscure. But I played Australian rules football for the Boston Demons for a number of years, and we won the U.S. championship. And we had this just random humans from Australia. And there's one guy who grew up in Western Australia, which is really isolated, and and he lived in the country out there, which is again, Australia's the most urbanized country in the world, basically, right? Which doesn't fit with its sort of story. But I grew up on a farm, but most people grew up in cities. Anyway, he realized later on this wasn't a game that everyone played, but his big brother played a game called Hunter, where the younger brother, had to run off into the bush, and his big brother would simply hunt him. It was a good sort of Mad Max type. It's just like, what are they doing out there? But like games that people play in their families, they can be pretty quirky and fun, but that would be inexplicable to other people. But that one had a pretty good straightforward thing. But it took him years later. It's like, oh, I was never allowed to hunt. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this madness here for a little bit because it is basically now on average the coldest day here. So this is some work that took a ridiculous amount of time, and but anyway, and isn't in any way itself famous, but that's okay. What's going on with you? I don't like how it just said it was connected. All right, well, we'll see what happens. Where's the thing? The thing is gone. Aqua Reed, where are you, you little beast? Is it here? Nope. Anyway, we've got fun things in it. So let me just, I guess, kill it. I don't know where it is. Okay, so Teletherm. Oh boy. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Groundhog Day to start with because it's great, and it's almost 30 years ago. Groundhog Day came out. You've seen it, right? No, you don't have to have seen it. You should watch this. You should watch this. This is like if you what's that?
I've seen it a while ago.
Yeah, you can watch it again, which is part of the greatness of it. Um, Anyway, Phil Connor's this guy, right? If you don't know, he wakes up and he's like, goes about his day, he hates everyone. He's near Pittsburgh, I think, and he's a weather report man, and he's doing the, Punxsutawney Phil situation, like how much longer will winter go? 2 or 6 weeks. There's some interesting other actors in here, but this became such a and what happens is, right? He goes to, I think he just goes to sleep that night. He wakes up again, and it's all the same. It's exactly the same, and that's the first thing he sees. And I've got you, babe, the same song, so it's weird. And he figures this out, right? That he's just living the same day over and over again. So it becomes an escape. So it's like it's a video game story, right? And so there are many variations on this. I always forget the name of this, but Edge of Tomorrow or Live, Die, Repeat, which was basically a video game type situation. This is a good one if you haven't seen this. This is it's Tom Cruise, whatever. Yeah, this is so. And you get further and further and further into it, and then as the viewer, you might try to figure out how many times I've done it. Anyway, it's a very, there's just a lot of because of Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day isn't, I don't think, referencing something behind it. It was just sort of created, and it's Bill Murray, and it's Phil Connor's name. Bill Murray and Harold Ramis, right? So the Ghostbusters maniacs made somehow the greatest existential film ever, but lots of other things, right? I've kind of used this in some way. So there's sort of an a win condition or escape condition that you kind of have to achieve, which is unknown usually somehow. That's kind of the idea. Every video game. So it becomes a trope, right? And so it's a name trope. That is the trope. Where is it? I want to put it there. Yes, of course. So, right, this is the trope, the loop. They have to do something. They realize they're in it. It's kind of a, restarting. Usually you can die, right? That's part of it as well. It doesn't not just go like you can die. So he figures that out, and there's a hilarious montage at some point where he just, gives up. Some pretty bleak things at times. I think he crashes with Phil in the car he calls I think they're all called Phil, right? There's the Groundhog. Police escapes and things. But all right, so that's the trope. It's a good trope. So there's our trope. Some estimates maybe it took 30 or 40 years to get out, right? Because he had to become a better person, basically, which he tries in various ways and gets further and further. Becomes a concert pianist, so that took a long time, sort of using the 10,000 hour rule. And he has to go and meet that person every day and pretend, of course, they've never met him, right? So no, right. Pretty good. There's a musical, which we saw, which was great, and it was surprisingly great. And Bill Murray went to see it on opening night, unannounced. And then, cast is kind of people were pretty excited about it. And then he went to see it again on the second night. So it all gets tied together, right? People like it, 97%, right? This is Rotten Tomatoes. Metacritic, which is the other sort of site that rates the ratings, if you like, the reviews, 60 to 90. Anyway, this is a nice one. I'm not going to read it up. It's basically, it's a moral tale. It's beautiful. It's complex. It is complex. And then it's one of the troubles you feel like you've been through with its zany episodes. Groundhog Day gets stuck in a non-progressive repetition. This is someone in 1993 who kind of didn't like it. Of course, this is not what happens. It is actually an evolution of a character as much as anything. All right. Okay, so what's all this got to do with things? So it turns out that roughly here, at this latitude, Groundhog Day is roughly the, on average, coldest day of the year, right? So this is 6 weeks after the solstice. The solstice, we kind of got that nailed down thousands of years ago, like all around the world. The English, who are, whatever. But I guess I'm descended from, which I'll point to in a second. But this is where the word comes from. It's sun and standstill. So there's this idea of, and you can stick a few big rocks together, drag them around, and put them in the right place and kind of line them up so that you have this recognition or identification of those longest and shortest days was part of what Stonehenge is, or maybe aliens put it there. It's a lot of, I mean, we live in this era of fake news, but 1980s sort of fake news was UFOs, and because no one had good cameras either, right? So, kind of went away as soon as good cameras came along. But Stonehenge is always a good one. Aliens built the ancient civilizations. I have stupid things around the world where this is when I taught linear algebra, where I'd have little bits. There's one at the Colosseum where I say something like, the Romans understood linear algebra. I don't know, it's just stupid. It's because someone's got to make it better. Anyway, we visited, which was a nice moment for me in some ways, because allegedly, this is like the origin of my paternal name. Dodd is supposed to be something to do with stones and things, like the megalithic Dodds. This is the Dodd, whatever. That's funny. The Dodd men were supposed, I read years ago, I don't know if it's still sort of thought to be true, but the Dodd men were supposed to be the Stonehenge characters who had rulers and things and figured out stuff and measured things, which is kind of nice. Of course, I'm like 1/100000th of those people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it is an old name, and that doesn't mean it's in any of the line there are good people. Okay, so solstices have, maybe you know this well, but I find like I have to think about this every year again. So it's right, so pretty good clock situation. 2021st for the 21st, 22nd roughly for the winter. It depends which side of the planet you're on, or which end, as we call it. But because of tilts and ellipses, the sunrises and sunsets don't match up, right? That's not the tightest. Did you know this? Yeah. So this is funny. So in fact, here depends where you are. So here, when do you think the earliest sunset is in Burlington? Like before or after the solstice? I'm telling you, it's not on the solstice. What's your sense of things? So it's something where, so this is where it's actually December 9. It's well before. It's almost, it's 2 weeks before is the short. So, we get the daylight savings thing, and it suddenly is incredibly dark. Well, actually, it is. You get a bit of a win after December 9th. It's actually starting, the days at the end of the day is starting to get longer, but it's the sunrise is moving faster up at the front. And the latest one is, so because it's a weird analemma situation, it's actually, this one is the sunrise we've had. Yeah, the latest sunrise we've had, but it's a bit of a blurred out kind of thing. So it's about a week where it's basically 7:30 a.m. and then starts to get earlier. So this is a long period of time. And this is really fully a month of kind of before we get it going back into the good stuff and getting some more sunlight. It's interesting. And it depends which planet you're on and which latitude, right? So you have to local. All right, so that's a big clock situation, even with some complications, right? It's still, even, this is complicated. Like these details are complicated, but we have very precise things. Tables, we can know where it will be in hundreds of thousands, or where it was in the past. Okay, so this is now something quite different, but matters to us tremendously, is the seasons, right? Sitting on top of that. And when I when I talk about measurement a lot, I do point to measuring time and then measuring temperature, right? And time being this older thing we could get hold of. However, it took us well into sort of developing things to get to measuring really precisely chronometers in the 1700s. That was so the English could go and colonize places with more efficiency, I guess. There was a lot of motivation. It was ship based. So, but measuring temperature takes a while, and of course recording it. So we don't have temperature measurements, from 1,000 years ago. We just don't have it. We can do weird things with ice cores, big story kind of things, but we don't have like day temperatures like we do now, and what the conditions were. However, if you have some monks that persist for a long time, and it's a mixture of people, there's some monks involved, there are aristocrats, there's a whole bunch of people. This is going back, this is 800 AD, this is 1200 years of recording the first cherry blossom in Kyoto, actually. And you can see it's pretty messy, right? This is a day into the year. This is the Julian day, so 70 days. So this would be, March 10th-ish. A lot of variation, right? So there's 40 days variation, but this is sort of the thing that people have been trying to kind of quantify. It is kind of, there isn't as much ceiling here. You want to be careful with this kind of analysis, but this is 2021, March 26th. So it's the earliest. That one I think is then the earliest in recorded. Yeah. So yay. And each year it depends. This is a 2017 article. This is a 2021 article. This is just signaling, and then they get to say this kind of stronger story here. I'm going to fix up this horrible. You see this? So there's a. I know this is. Oh, okay. I'm not good at anything, but I want to make a. How do I get that to work? No. Okay. This is a ridiculous thing, but you see this? That apostrophe? This is a text thing. This matters if you're processing text. That stupid thing there is different, right? That's not a normal, like the apostrophe. The most basic one is that one. These are different, and there are like 4 or 5 apostrophes floating around. So this is just a bit of hell space we invented for ourselves. I mean, the font should render it in some way, but there are like 4 character versions underneath. I mean, we should just reboot the universe at this point. I mean, anyway, this is just a horrible little thing to, you can do a search and replace if you have a whole bunch of them or whatever, or do scripts to do it. But anyway, so that, and of course, that's what's causing this bit of disgustingness up here. Sorry. It will matter. I mean, it's just horrible. Okay, so this is the website that's, where they've been updating this thing for a long time. Okay, so that's not great, but it's a very I mean, it's a very special data set. It's kind of impressive. Of course, dendrochronology is another place if we think about time and temperature and seasons. So it's tree ring, study of tree rings. You see how things work. First leaves is another one. This is a paper devoted to the when leaves first appear and recordings of that. So that this one's more. It's not just one place like Kyoto. This is a global event, and they're trying to. They have a finding that spring is coming earlier. So, I mean, obviously, we'd be really worried if the sun kind of moved around and we had to adjust Stonehenge. The bad situation. But spring changing and the seasons changing. I mean, this is now agriculture and food, and it's not just beautiful cherry. I mean, that's a charismatic, fauna. Did I get the right? No, flora that that's a good thing to have recorded and something that makes for a good story. But there are really deep problems. Okay, so I was interested in this because I sort of thought, oh, it is colder. It gets colder after the solstice, and I wonder what that is, right? And if that's a special. So this is a many-year process. This is a data science kind of thing in the end of figuring out how we could measure this. So I'll just try to show you some of this. And came up with this, we call it Teletherm. So that's like tele is far, right? So, and temperature, heat, right? So it's sort of the endpoints of heat. So it's a Greek version of analog of solstice, which is more like end. So this is just some notes. This is from 2009. Phrygistus, thermistus, where I was trying to mess around with these ideas and these sort of statistically. So now it's got to be statistical, right? It's not going to be a clock situation. It's got to be statistical. And, you know, some like we saw for the cherry trees, right? There's a lot of variation, which is understandable. Groundhog Day, I was kind of excited. I thought maybe it was Groundhog Day in general. I'm kind of looking at some of these other celebrations, these like Imbolc and Candlemas, and you know, it again, this matters tremendously. So this became the paper. I have a little website that I'll show you. You can kind of play around with, teletherm.org, and you can see that I used absolutely terrible color palette. So I'm going to redo that at some point because you can. I'll put it back on the archive. All right, so a couple of things. So what we do, so you have from the National Weather Service, right? This is different to where people live. There's a pretty good coverage of the U.S. in terms of weather stations, right? So they're located fairly uniformly because they're doing the right thing. They're just trying to measure, temperature across the whole. Really is looking at 48 states, that whole landmass. And they're pretty variable though in terms of when they were recording. So this is Death Valley, for example. So we'll just use this as a start. And you see there's really no, this is 1853 as the first entry. First of all, again, thermometers had to be invented and people had to start recording stuff and make it reliable. So this little image here means there's 0 here. And after, 950s kind of got it together and it's recorded faithfully every day. This is like a little histogram. You see this one over here. This is Willow City in North Dakota. Before 1900, there starts to be recordings, and you can see it's a bit, doesn't get 365 or 366 days each year. I have another version of this which shows you, it makes for giant images, but it has dots to show you exactly where the recording is. And what you tend to find is, it's in the winter when things are not great and people struggle to just do things, or the thermometer's frozen, or whatever's going wrong. There's a snowstorm. So it makes sense as to what's going on there. Yeah, this is hot, right? I remember reading a story of a guy who lives there saying that the difference between 117 and 118, that was very real. Like 117, it's okay, but 118, that was his experience. But I grew up with a lot of heat, and it's not quite, not quite as hot as this, but you certainly get over 110, 115. Real problem, place like Phoenix, terrible. There's a place in Oman that had a night with a minimum of 107 or 8 in the last few years, which is, that's the thing. If it's above 72 at night, that's bad, right? If it doesn't cool down, it's rough on people. They're death, especially older people. There's a fragility, there's loss of life due to just heat trauma, essentially. There's some evidence that people become more violent as well, but we have to look at that. I mean, it sort of makes sense, right? It's like a hot summer in cities, and people are out and can't sleep, so it makes sense. But I'm not. Okay. So all of these, I think there are 1,200 stations. They all have plots like this. There's a solstice point on them, depending if it's winter or summer, right? So this is June 21st, and then this is an effort to kind of get these are points over many years, right? In the black points, and then there's just a simple smoothing filter, and we just run a little filter across, like we're doing, like I've asked you to do for the happiness measurements, right? Just a very simple little block filter, just runs along, averages everything. You can play around with different shapes. And all we did was change the width of that kernel, right? And so, right, how much are you averaging? The this little inset is up here. This is to sort of show you kind of the median and quartiles and so on if you put many together. But you know, you see this is fairly, and it's warmer. The hottest day is you know somewhat. It's in July, right? So it's in the end of July. This is all of July. So the end of near the end of July, but it's different to like a shortest day kind of situation. Although that is pretty smoothed out. There's really a period of days. So there's sort of a when it's within two, I think we came up with when it's within 2% of the maximum of the range, if you like, just the range, then we'll just sort of say that's the warmest time, right? So this little block in here is the Teletherm. So it is the summer one. It's the hottest thing. So that's the hottest one in the U.S. You know, on average over this time, it's 115. You know, that's hot. And this is it's Fahrenheit to keep it in. And this one here is -10. So that's pretty rough. That's the coldest. You know, that's at night. That's the coldest temperature. A little bit harder to measure, and it's fairly, you know, it's a fairly kind of clean sort of shape. There are a couple of other outlier ones that are interesting. This is the earliest summer teletherm. It actually somehow is somewhere. It's in Alpine, Texas. It actually manages to happen pretty much on the solstice, right? It's like it just gets hot, and you take the heat away, and it cools down. And we'll see kind of that it varies a lot across the U.S. But if anything, it's a little bit earlier, which is unusual. This is the earliest winter one, so it's again kind of lined up with the solstice. So you can imagine that's the best you can do. You can see this kind of measurement problems here. They recorded it way back for the first 25 years of the last century. No good, and now it's been turned back on again. Santa Cruz is super weird, and you get a completely different thing on the west coast, and it doesn't go in, but just on that edge. This is the, you know, it's getting warmer and warmer, but then it starts to drop down as soon as we get to the solstice, and it's that kind of whole world of fog and, you know, the Pacific. And actually, the warmest day is typically around the equinox, so a full 3 months off. This is really, you know, peculiar. You know, people will talk about how hot it is in LA in October, right? It's just a different thing. You don't have to go very far inland for these things to change, so it's really effective to see. And this is the latest winter teletherm, and this is out in February for this one. This is in Michigan. It's out in February, and you can see there are actually 2 in here. So this is another feature we see. You can see statistically there are a couple. So that's true for Burlington, which talks about having a January thaw. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. There's sort of a little warmer spot. Statistically, it was true. It actually was that kind of case. So I'll show you a few more things about this. This is sort of estimates of those sort of central teletherm points. It's an attempt to do it. These are the summer ones. Again, the color map is terrible. But going from June 19th, so just before the summer teletherm, around to the equinox, you can see how weird the west coast is in terms of the warmest day. It's just there. And as soon as you go in a little bit, that boundary is completely lost. This is Santa Cruz, right? Very, very odd. They're really warm late into the year. And you see the sort of smooth kind of change. There's some, you know, there's some variation around here in Texas. And when you get to the winter one, there's sort of a bit of a clocking over, and this is sort of you know, this is real winter. The snow sets in and pushes it around, and the redder ones are sort of further out into February, so that's really pushed around. And there it's really a bimodal distribution of when the winter one is. That's sort of taking everything together. What you can then do is like look at whether things have changed. So this is the summer teletherm shifts for a 50-year period for these 2 adjacent 50-year periods. And so you can see the summer teletherm's coming later here in this region. It's coming earlier in some of the places. So there's this very like that, the stuff with the leaves budding, you know, it sort of talks about the northern hemisphere. A lot of big models are just about hemisphere. But there's fairly detailed variation. And when it comes to people thinking about climate change and the story of it and so on, there's other work that shows that where there's been locally the biggest change in climate by some other measure, that's when people believe it more, right? Like locally, there's been more change. People are more, you know, when you ask them questions about it, they're more likely to believe it. I mean, it's not surprising, but to sort of just to emphasize just how variable it is. It's not like everywhere is getting warmer. Everywhere is it's actually, and if you go through the last century, it got cooler. Scientists, and this is sort of one thing that gets brought up now and then by people who are against all this. There was a time where scientists in the 60s were talking about, well, maybe we should melt the polar caps, and there's going to be an ice, because they're worried about an ice age. I don't know if you know about this, but that story is there, so it makes scientists look like idiots because we said this thing, but it's of course science tries to get better as it goes along. So pretty big changes here for the winter one, right? This is much later, but you just go across here and you start to see it hasn't really changed much, but it's come earlier here. And the effect of it coming earlier here is partly because there's not as much snow lasting into the winter. If you look at these, so these now show sort of the midpoint, but also like these Teletherm periods, right? And this is in Mississippi. This is a summer one. And you can see it kind of has a switch. And we did have some work done on this. It's not finished, but there's really a switch where it's become earlier. You can see evidence of like trimodal kinds of things, that there's these sort of bumps. But there's this warm period, and then this sort of goes away. It's pretty durable here. It's like really clearly a hot day of the year, or few days. That's in the middle of the century. Then it sort of drops back and switches. So these are, it's quite detailed and nuanced and problem. If you live in these places, right, things change over generations. That's another kind of switching thing. This is one where it sort of switched and then got to an average, and then it's broken apart again. This is a more stable one, but again, a kind of winter thing where it's getting, maybe if anything, getting a little later in the year, but then just, and it's gone. This is again, this sort of, this is moving out of that mid-century cooler period and then into what's been more like recently. And if anything, if you look through the whole of things last year, I don't know if it kind of shows it here. These are just a few examples. But if anything, what's happened is the minimum temperature in the winter is lifted up. It's gotten a bit hotter, but it's really the bottom's warmed up. So that's sort of, we talk about global, there's climate change and global warming, and the warming is sort of thought, probably think, and we've just talked about it a little bit. I mean, I have, but the hottest day kind of thing. But it's actually also the winter is not getting as cold. And I don't know. There was a big story last year. I don't know if you saw it, but Australia having mouse plagues. Did you see that?
They didn't know that.
Because the winter, yeah, the winter's not cold enough. Yeah. So there were a couple maybe I mentioned in Pox, but there were a couple when I was growing up, and it's just mice everywhere. You lift up anything that's covered something, just mice just go everywhere. It's a total mayhem. They actually dig warrens out in the fields and eat everything. All right, so we do have this website. Where's Teletherm? Click on this. Oh, let me do that all the time. Okay. There it is. So this is a different visualization. So Andy Regan, we worked together to make this. This hasn't really actually been kind of published, but it's kind of a cool thing. So this is it's hard to see this perhaps, but this is a 25-year period where we're doing the averaging, the next 25 years and the next 25 years. So these are sort of blocks. And so this is for Burlington. And you can see that the summer one has this sort of, it gets a bit warmer, right? So the ring of the average temperature is here. The ring of the lowest temperature is here. Is that me? Oh, no, it's okay. It's okay. Whatever. Things beep. It wants to be fed. Feed me photographs. This is, it's a bit warmer here. And then there's sort of this long Teletherm period. So, if you live here, then July is the warmest. It's the middle of July is going to be the warmest thing. And often you get to August and it gets cool. It starts to get cool straight away, like in the second half. It used to, at least. Yeah.
So one thing, I guess this is going to be looking back, but on those Teletherm shift maps, it was interesting to see that like two cities next to each other could be like positive versus negative. I wonder if that's like is one of them like a city versus are these all cities or like?
Yeah, so they're in a lot of interesting places. They're usually some are airports, right? Which sort of puts them in open places. There's mountain ranges. There's all sorts of structures that could change what it is locally. But no, you're right. I mean, there's some pretty sharp. There's also just the quality of recording. The Rockies are here, right? So this is a big thing.
Did you look at where the Appalachian Trail would be? It's interesting that in terms of summit.
Like this, there's a cut through here.
For the southern, like summer Teletherm shifts, it's all pretty uniform, and then for winter, it's pretty different.
Yeah, right. It's a different thing. So this is really kind of changed in texture, and because of this local variability, right? It's not just like everywhere's doing something. It means some places have gotten better, according to what we like, as humans. And one of the few places gotten that isn't like in the human sort of comfort zone by some measures is here. It's just too cold in the winter, right?
So I feel like you would think like heat. I guess like maybe looking at heat in this scale would like behave similarly for like cold versus warm because it's just less heat. But I guess
you think it might be symmetric.
Well, I don't know if it's like symmetric, but like it seems weird that like you're just throwing the split on like the Appalachia there, like how it's different for like summers. Yeah, you'd think it'd be the same, right? Yeah, because like it's just less heat, right? It's not like cold is different.
Well, it's how it gets stored, though, and it's like right, just cities. I mean, cities will be a bit different. Like, does it get warmed up? Like in New York City, if you're in New York City, remember, like if you ride from riding a bike, if you ride a bike, through the, you're out in the lattice of it. It's really hot, and then you get to the park, and just the transition is incredible, right? It's really can be very different being on. Like if you're here and you go to Shelburne Farms, it's like just much cooler out in that kind of point structure, noticeably different. Yeah, and of course elevation, you go up a little bit, can be.
Well, it's cooler by like 1 or 2.
Right.
One of these things that I was growing up with like Channel 5 News and Saranac Lake is always like 2 or 3 degrees colder.
Right. And if they put it on which side they put it on, right? Like if you put it over on this, yeah. So, so there's a lot, but so there's going to be some variation, geographic sort of stuff, but then there's sort of broad regional things that I think you can kind of pick out. We have these flip books where you can kind of go through and see kind of how it's shifting. Maybe I won't bring that out, but they're like, oh, the flip books are so good. All right, maybe I should stop. So these are sort of fun little things. You can see again, there's this like, so here's winter for Burlington, right? So, and there's no data here because we're trying to average over 25 to 50 years, I think. But you can see that kind of switching. And then, this is the Groundhog Day type winter, but sort of maybe it's popping back and being earlier. But when you're in this sort of period here, you can sort of see it's a bit warmer in there. There's sort of a heating up. So you're sort of somewhat durable, right? But a bit of a switch in when the warmest day is. I mean, that's a pretty big, and also like this is opened out. It's the longer periods of heat. Some of those places in Mississippi, it's just like months where it's just like hot. This doesn't have humidity or anything like that, but it's really rough on people. But yeah, these kind of 3D ones. And what is really hard to see in here is that's the winter Teletherm. Is that little gap in there? There are a couple of little bands in here, and it's widened out a little bit as well here. So I guess we should draw these all out. They should be drawn to the edge, I guess. Yeah. Andy, this is just a ridiculous thing. So you can see that's an airport, and so the locations are a bit funny. This is North Dakota. that kind of swelling of got hotter for a while. You can see that real drop there, the real, right, really pulls in and then pops out again. But that's sort of smoothed out again here. That was pretty sharp. What else we got?
Are there any that are like super circular? Like that one's a little more circular.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're near, well, the equator or certain things like that, you can get some really. They're pushed off. That's Nevada. This is Colorado. Little cardioid action. I mean, really, it gets sharply cold in some of these places. That one's a little rounder. North Carolina, These are kind of fun. Fort Collins, okay, interesting. See, then this is weird, right? So it really dropped back. It doesn't. Its winter has changed quite a bit, right? And it should be a place with snow, I would think. Yeah. Minnesota, a lot of them have these things. So Idaho, let's see if we can get another. So Santa Rosa, which I think might be on the coast, right? So it then really pushes it around. But it sort of has this confusing kind of thing that can happen, right? Sort of warm in different parts, durably, right? All right. Yeah, there's a lot in this ridiculous thing. So papers, patents. But yeah, took many years, as usual. Let's see. All right, so we can talk about that. It's quite serious. So there's the overall things, like a lot of stuff sitting in here, right? So there might be some messy things. I've got some things to clean up, right? They've just sort of got stuck in my top directory, so that's bad. But mostly it should be directories, and then things like work. So that's where I do my data, or any kind of modeling or whatever that lives in there. And so they have big categories. You can kind of see over time. Well, you can't see, but over time they've become more. So rivers. This is my thesis. Small worlds. This is really just one big project. But they've become more general, like sports and stories, socio-technical systems, language, and so. But within them, like stories, these are efforts to do things. So they're all year and month, which we've sort of talked about. And I try to. One thing I didn't mention with that is, you want to use a good descriptive title, like put tags in there. This will be a title, and then early on with the web, you go to a page on New York Times, or whatever, and you'd link to, you go to some article, and if you looked at the URL, it was just like, some database junk, right? Blah. But now people, did figure out, like, do this, write down the title basically in the thing, and it's very helpful. So there's a lot of different stuff in here. A lot of these things, maybe did or didn't work. I've been playing around with Sherlock Holmes and character stuff more recently, so it's sort of floating around there. This is just a stories one, but if you go back to like psychology, you can sort of see that there was all this work in the first half of the last decade, and then I've kind of added a few more in here, but it moved into stories, language, and kind of other framings. I found it useful to have big categories. It depends what you work on, but I found it useful to have big categories. Papers have a similar kind of thing. So the papers are in a separate place. They're like this. So stories, for example, kind of like that. And then within those, they'll link to the figure directories. So all of these things are symbolic links, which is I find a really important structure. And what this means is this paper is sitting in this directory, but it's not really in there, right? It's somewhere else. So if we do that one, it's going to be, I think, in disasters. Right, so it says go, if you can see this, go back out to disasters, up one directory, back to disasters, and it's in there. And the reason for doing that is, things are in different spaces, and I forget where they are, so I tend to do this Knowledge is not just a big branching tree. So over time, lots of papers that never quite get finished or get rebuilt as something else. I try to make them big. They're code objects themselves when I write things. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say you kind of just like using your directories as like a NoSQL database.
Yeah, very simplistic, just text, but it's there. You can see it, you can read it, right? So that's I do have one big other space which I've liked, which is just called I called it Flow, and
It's funny, but once you're in it, like it's I think you'd like Obsidian. It like allows you to organize your directories and files in this way, and then you can like view it as a network.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah, that would be
so
good.
You can see exactly how things. You can link things in documents and directories, and then you can look at how all your things that you're doing are connected.
So I live pretty primitively, right? I work in the terminal, so it's just unit. Well, yeah, it's just Unix stuff. So it's not. I mean, it is nice now and then to use the Finder thing because it does have some properties that just. So it's good to. It's like a lot of things. Good to have this is the lectures directory. It's like 3,500 files in here, but the main thing in those is, it's these things, right? They're all the base things, and I have a script that wraps everything around them and builds them, right? So this is a lot of. I mean, if you this thing, there's 100,000 lines of LaTeX in that madness, which is wrong. But this is the top directory for Pox. It's reasonably kind of. I mean, it's changed over time. There's some flotsam that's like injected, sort of left around, but basically good. The website has its own thing. There's a settings thing. I know. So it's just. I mean, I'm a bit sad. Obviously, I'll get run over by a truck one day, and I have this sort of like, this enormous sort of space of things, and I don't know what. I mean, I guess we'll just have the papers you produce and YouTube videos maybe and things like that. But it's there's a lot of stuff in here that I can't get out. There's like 30 or 40 papers, that I've listed to write. It's a struggle. So yeah, like anyway. I mean, I would like to. I think it would be good to talk about this more. I mean, maybe the Obsidian thing is everything, but you have to be. It's good to keep things very simple.
Yeah, if you've kept that system, at least I think that's like 2008 in there, so
Yeah,
for a while.
Since my PhD, it's 1990s actually.
Yeah, I don't know.
It works.
It works for you.
But you want something that you just like. You don't want something that's too buried in some database because it will just. Like it's very hard. It's very hard. So this is this flow thing. So I have a thing that just does datafy and it puts a month and year and the date on the front, and it will put it in this space. So this is like a miscellaneous bin. It's a lot of stuff you get that just, at least it's dated. It's like in order, and you could find it and try to name them with a lot of things. So if you need the such and such, you could. So then there's a universal things like this, right? Like, so MD, this is at least on Mac, MD find.
I've been using grep recently.
Oh, well, so, okay. So this is good because I want a t-shirt that just says grep. Locate is the basic one on Linux or Unix, right? And it was sort of invented there, I think. But yeah, MD find will find all the files that have a pattern in it, or I do it with a name. I don't want the ones that have it in the name. That's pretty useful. So your tree is important, and then you can also just do this. I think a lot of people live though with just like there's just a big pile of stuff, and the last thing that went in is the first thing that pops out, and that's sort of serviceable, but there's no structure. It's sort of horrifying to think about what's going on in people's. I mean, I think it would be pretty harrowing actually to do some sort of data science thing where you get everyone's how the names they have, it'd be just horror. It's like looking into someone's mind. What is in your mind?
Someone tried to analyze resumes, And that alone, they were like, I can't really do this because there's no structure to this.
There's no structure.
And it's also like everyone formats their resumes like incredibly differently in like different sections.
Because they're trying to stand out a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like really hard to like actually pinpoint what is going on here.
You need to have gone through a system where it's like answer this question, answer this, and even that's going to be the free form stuff is.
Like case then to which I think I heard something about like people whose rooms are like messier or maybe messier in a certain way are like more creative. Does that apply to organizations like files or anything like that?
I don't. Right, the people have the volcanic.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like. I don't know if it's I have to go back and find it to see what it actually says. I'm sure it's not just like.
I think it's one of those things that has a nice story. It has a nice. Well, the problem with that too is then people use that as the input, right? It's like wearing the famous clothes of a famous person or something. It's like this is not actually how the deep mechanism is working. This is some sort of accidental, some observable, right? But it's not really what's going on in the mind, which might be some steel trap situation. It's just like they only think about these three things and they've forgotten about everything else. That's really what it is. It's like deep focus, maybe. Plus, they get too much mail. We're still, all right. This is fair enough to talk about this.
One thing that's interesting is like a work magazine called Confluence, and it's like internal Wikipedia essentially. And one day I want to just like paint all the words from it and just like, how is it? It's your turn. Look at internal Wikipedia relative to like what everybody in your like group does. Like there's gonna be so much you can learn from that.
So people have really. This has been around for a long time, right? So as soon as people have computers and they're like starting to do this and the web exists, Bernardo Huberman, I remember, did this maybe at Xerox PARC. They were trying to like do a thing that like looked at I mean, it sounds much. I mean, it wasn't great then, but it sounds much more sinister now. Like I think people would be much more upset. Like basically go through everyone's system and index it or whatever, and to figure out what you might know. So that then, as a company, if you say I need someone who knows the such and such and what, it could pop something up to you. It's like, oh, that person seems to have a lot on their drive. I mean, you can see where this is go horribly wrong, right? But also just be useful, like not. So there are attempts like how do you, and I do have a whole lecture thing on that's a network story about organizations, right? Like how do you structure organizations to do whatever it is you want to do, right? To innovate, to the military's thought about this a lot, right? As much as anyone. I mean, very, very seriously. I mean, obviously the criterion for them is life or death sort of situation, right? So they, how do you organize people in the field? Who reports to whom? Especially now that it's not just like the people you can see. You have potentially you can unlock any amount of communication. I mean, you could have everyone yelling at everyone else. Could be all to all. Obviously, that doesn't work. So what do you do like? How do you change that on the fly? Like, how do you make that adapt? So, organizations have the same, like more benign things, obviously, but there's something goes wrong in a place. Like, how do you then fix it? How do you bring people together? We try to do it in democracy. Well, okay, so that, I mean, look, these are really, like, how do you structure society? Like, how do you do these things? I mean, these are deep problems that people thought about for thousands of years, and sometimes it's just an egghead who says, I think we'll have communism. Like in a room, like it's not like they ran a simulation. Of course, we have civilization now. You can kind of do it, but it's really unclear. And it's if you set up a rule set, like here's the Constitution and some rules. We're going to try a different thing. We're also going to set up the rules so that they will evolve. Because we also know the country's going to get bigger. I mean, that's a ridiculously difficult thing to try to do.
Right, I was going to say, like, in terms of organizing an office, you can kind of just let the people walk in and they'll kind of organize themselves the way the students do in the classroom. You can't do that in the country.
I mean, The U.S. sort of did in a way, right? I mean, right, it's very, very right. Like there's West or something. Yeah, not great. Yeah, right, not great. But right, once things are but things get set hierarchically, you're stuck. Like, do you want that kind of world? I mean, Leviathan, right? Kings are great. This is good. This is the best possible system. Or democracy is the best of the worst things. You know, people are pretty sure about their place. You know, like religions, you know, impose ways to behave, and the principle is that if you behave in these kind of funny ways sometimes, as long as everyone does that, we're gonna have a better world than not. I mean, it's not. I mean, I have no idea. It's not clear. People are pretty weird. I think one of the things, much as we've sort of studied people in the, you know, forever, but also in the last 100 years, and economists have come along to study people.
Julia said New England got first mover advantage.
Who did?
New England.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. And then proceeded to burn some witches. But what? Gosh, what was I going to say? I've lost my track. Oh dear. What was I saying? Anyway, it's not obvious how you should set things up. You know, we seem to value in some society like fluidity, right? So people who, oh, okay. What I was trying to say was this: like a lot of what is still absent from a lot of thinking, even behavioral economics, it's just the social effects, right? They'll sort of do it in a raw way, but you know, like an individual is feeling social pressure, but it's not. It's the network of people and behaving in a certain way that gives rise to some macroscopic thing, like market behavior or whatever it is, right? There's still this sort of idea that people do some crazy things in markets, but it kind of washes out. But that's not true if you've got everyone following each other, right? I mean, that's clearly when things kind of go wrong. We seem to be very. I know it's a good story that everyone's individual, making their own decisions, and they can kind of, you know, overcome situations. But you know, we're being right. I mean, we're kind of a, you know, at the same. I mean, I talk about in pucks a lot. I mean, at the same time, we sort of understand we're herd animals. We're sort of sheeple. You know, we have these kind of terms, but I don't, you know. But that's not. That needs to be built in from the start. If you can, I think, if you tried to create a new rule set for humanity, like Elon Musk is going to do on Mars, probably. They're toast, right? That's going to be sad. But you know, there's going to be some sort of thinking about what happens when big collectives, you know, people following each other. You know, like just it could go wildly off the rails.
I think Musk is just trying to start a cult in which no one can stop him, and that's Mars.
Well, I mean, at this point he may have whatever view of it. It's happening. You know, like he has.
But no, it's gone. He's gone.
Yeah, whether he likes it or not. Well, I mean, it's bizarre. What the adulation for him is just really bizarre. I mean, I know some of it's in train the fact they're making money out of investing in him, but there's also just people who think he's a god genius who will lead us into.
Do you think he'll actually go?
Is he almost 60?
Yeah, he's older.
It would really suck. It would really suck. I don't think so. It's a lot. It takes a while to get there still, right?
Yeah. I just think
it's really going to be bad. Maybe one day.
He's like, I'm going to go. He's like, I'm going to be one of the first people. And I'm like, are you?
Okay. I mean, it's not so. You know, what is it? Bezos is 2 minutes in space.
He'll probably just require his astronauts to get that is what makes sense. Just be Android.
Okay, let me try to show you this. I'll show you one flip. I'll show you one flipbook thing. Oh, it's the summer one. I didn't want the summer one. Is this is the winter one? Let me see. Let me see if this works. So this is going to be the winter teletherm as 25-year things, and then so there are all these kind of figures, and then as we sort of move through, it's just going to slide this window through. So you'll sort of see where these arrows kind of move, right? Like just 1 year at a time. Color scheme's not great. You can see that kind of change there in the south. east. And this is the middle of the century. Yeah, I need to change the color scheme. But you said, oh, it's a big, that's a lot. So these are sort of winters where it's kind of really, at the end of the year, and then it's going to kind of start to come back into this colder. I mean, sort of the cold is more durable, I think. Yeah. So it's an intricate measure of climate change. I mean, it's and I think it's really needed. I mean, people live in these places, and they. Yes. How does that do that? Am I going the wrong way? No, I'm sorry. I tried to, but normal ones are bad. The best one's to make a MP4 and then use a movie. I can do it. It's much better. So I have that for these kinds of things, like that's what I've been doing for these. So these look better, right? Which we'll talk about at some point. What happened in the Trump years? Like what happened? These are like links to stories. This is sort of that's starting in 2020 and then coronavirus. George Floyd is murdered. Yeah. It's hard to remember what happened, right? So that's going to be the game there. I mean, I think it's hard to remember what happened, but that's a little looping. That's better. That's better. But if you try to put it on Twitter, it looked terrible. Yeah. It is. We're still fixing it up because UVM canned our site. Like they destroyed every site that had PHP in it, which is fair enough. But we weren't concentrating, so our site was dead for a couple of years. But it's sort of, let's see, is it alive? We have a former student who's been fantastic. She's helping out. It exists here, but we're starting to get, because there's a whole blog site, and which is a shame to lose all of that. We had some good stuff there. Oh, sure.
How effective / how much of a role do you think good visualizations should play in deprogramming inflows and countering disinformation?
I mean, I think everything has to be in a story, right? It has to be in a story, and I think it can do it, but it has to be in a beautiful story. And there was you probably haven't. I listened to a podcast the other day with Jon Stewart, right? He's The Problem, yeah. So he does a podcast associated with that, and the most recent one is talking to a BBC, I think an elections, like foreign affairs election specialist who was in the US for the 2020 election and just interviewing people. And he says the thing that, I think is the thing, halfway through or whatever. It's basically all the fact checking in the world, every fact you throw at people, it's not going to work, right? It's just not going to work. You have to compete with stories. Now, on the science side, we have to tell beautiful stories about true things, right? And same with journalists, right? You have to, right? It has to be the truth in the middle, but you have. So it might not be beautiful, like it might be an ugly equation or whatever it is. It doesn't like the truth and beauty thing is not is garbage, right? Like that's not right. It's a real misdirect. But there's truth, and it can be told beautifully. It might be beautiful, but it can be told or well or powerfully in a way that spreads. So I think as part of something, yes. I mean, there's definitely a fundamentally scientific kind of effort with these. This is the summer one. Let me do this one. I mean, things are changing. Yeah. I think in terms of politicians in the last 34 years in the U.S., you have Trump is a sort of a storytelling genius, right? I mean, he really is he's a storyteller. I mean, everything is story, and he looks for stories and tries to push them and whatever. He's not in control of it necessarily, but he's good at trying a billion things, and you forget about the stuff that didn't work. And Bill Clinton was a good storyteller. And he would do this thing I'm sort of talking about, which is he would bring a lot of numbers in. Not always, but he'd have some facts and stuff, and guess it was true, but it was like it was in a story, and they'd then say something about 10% of people did this last year or whatever, and it's like gone up.
The 93 crime bill.
What's that?
That's how we passed the 93 crime bill. Like that was like we have like
Storytelling.
What?
With what?
That's how we had like with the basically like when he coined the term or when he coined the term super predator.
She used it, didn't she? Yeah.
Yeah,
Not
to
great.
like talk about 16-year-olds with guns. And then like they basically created a story about like looking at demographics in like younger cities of younger people in like inner cities, talking about rises in murders in the last 2 years. And that's how we got like the biggest, most comprehensive like crime bill ever passed in U.S. history.
I mean, you've got to use there's political rhetoric. There's no question, and things like death panel was a pretty good one. That was one that was used to fight against the Obamacare. That was Make America Great Again. It's fantastically powerful compared to like Build Back Better, et cetera, or whatever, right? Or I'm with her. That was a terrible slogan. So look, there's a lot in there. It's not to say that it's and then the thing is you can get a long way just with story. I mean that's the amazing part. But what you have to do is still fight that with story, but it has to be based on truth and also principled things about how you think you're going to fix the world. You will see that disinformation people use numbers all the time, right? They do. They really do. And they'll point to scientific papers whenever it works. So that's definitely in the game, right? It's not pure, when I say stories, I mean, they're still making things up completely wholesale. Like a funny tick for Trump is, well, he would say in 2 weeks, right? This is a number, right? It's actually a number. Like in principle, you could do that. You could say, okay, put in the calendar and come back and ask. But everyone's forgotten everything. I mean, I think after a while I realized, like, that is my view of that, is like you realize that was a time frame that suggests you were going to do it, but also no one would really check because it's not just 1 week, which maybe they'd be sort of, but 2 weeks. He did whatever. It's pretty interesting, and it was like a little thing he had. Yeah. He also say 17 a lot too, which is a real tie. Yeah, the 17 angry Mueller and the 17 angry Democrats, or the 19. He would use a lot. Yeah, it's funny. Well, it's either being used to like totally, to lie or to make up something for fun, right? In TV shows or something, right? Like, so it's always there's you have to figure out why it's popping into their heads. So look, I mean, the struggle for us with visualizations has been, 12, 13 years ago would have been Flash. Like that was the best thing you could do. Then, of course, D3 came along. We used it a lot, but it's very special. It's very difficult to work with. I mean, all of these things, you guys know Python, right? I mean, or whatever. And it's powerful, but sort of has real limits at that kind of the graphics engine. But, I don't know. I look through a lot of papers that take off. I don't, people obviously don't care too much about figures, but I sort of had this idea for a long time that papers could be apps, like there's sort of this great, amazing thing. I mean, especially with knowledge, you want to lift it out into this. I mean, that's when you look at something like Wikipedia versus, the battle we had with encyclopedias having to fit on in 3 dimensions, like or really linear, it's like tick, 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 it's in order, we'll make it alphabetic. That's insane, right? I mean, that's not how knowledge is stored. And Britannica actually had the alphabetic one, and then I don't know the name, but they had a second one, which was by
the app idea I really like
category.
Well, one thing I hated when I was writing a few papers with Jason Bates along with Carter a while back is that like the PDFs are not like interactive. Like I love.
No, they're terrible.
Library called Plotly. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah. You can make.
Like, it's like every one of those like little pins would have like hub data when you have it open. You would click in on the state and you would do a new page, and that's like that's level of exploration I feel like you need.
Yeah. No, you need to play around with these things, and I do these kind of very ridiculous flipbook things, right? But I mean, they work for some of these things. But you know, clearly when we got to some of this more sophisticated stuff, yes, D3 is great. I think Plotly might be what we ended up with Story Wrangler, as is, you know, and it's functional, but it doesn't quite lift a little bit more, so it becomes a beautiful thing, which would be, you know, nice. But in terms of like, does it work? And yeah, you definitely want to be able to run. Like I can't run around and pop up what this is and like zoom in. You know? So we're getting all the geo stuff, right? ArcGIS, like it's been around for a long time. Horrible to use, just dreadful. You know, it's gotten better. You know, because it was all pre-web kind of stuff. I mean, I think things will just, I don't know, you know, maybe Julia will be this sort of great thing, the promise, for example, for our code stuff, but you know, what's going to be like D3, just, we can't all learn D3. That's not right.
And also Julia doesn't have the best, like all the visualization libraries, for the most part, are just like borrowing Python's visualization library. It's just got way better, like, math implementation. The scientific computing is just so much better. Yeah.
Usually you want some sequencing of things, right? I mean, it would be great if it all worked inside it, but none of these things do a good job. I mean, you know, maybe Plotly is the thing. Usually people are trying to do it. There's the observable HQ thing, which is, you're familiar with that? That's it is what's his name? The guy who did D3. Trying to do it. It's kind of like Jupyter Notebooks thing's gone wild. You should check it out. I mean, for a lot of my the way I think about things, I think The Economist is really inspirational in terms of the way they present things. It's just worth looking at. New York Times has done some great stuff. Washington Post, but New York Times in particular has done. But they're sort of very one-off. They're one-off, amazing visualizations, and you have to kind of, if you like them, you need to kind of record them somewhere because they'll just forget about them.
That's what's so weird. I was looking at like data science like jobs a while back, and like I saw that all these like newspaper people were hiring like software engineers and like data scientists like build these wicked visualizations. Of course, like even like Grammarly, right? Like they were hiring a PhD data scientist with an English background, which is like, yeah, there can't be many.
Right. I mean, we're trying to create those people. I mean, yeah, it's good. That's good to hear. That's nice. Graphs, such a big thing. Anyway, these are, so you could check this one out. But again, it's another world of stuff. You know, like, do you tell, you know, we don't have a thing where it says students, you should all learn this thing. You know, it's like a little, I don't know what to say. All right. Okay. Well, I guess I wanted to give the Teletherm a good run, and we did that. So, but basically, on average, this is Groundhog Day is tomorrow, and it's this week is sort of on average. Doesn't mean it is, of course. And if you say this sort of thing, people will say, "Look, it's snowing outside, or it's sunny. Climate change is not real," or whatever. Your whole thing is wrong. You know, like it's fluky, but you know, it will trend towards being warmer after this. But it's a good while after the shortest day. Anyway, it's good to know these things, I think. Took a long time to figure that out. Anyway, I would, I don't know, it'd be amazing if something came along and was just like this took off and was the best thing. I mean, it'd be great. It'd be great. It would really help. It would really help. Yes, it would be so great. You know, like.
Really good ones. They're like expensive one, and like two, once you're in, you take it out, like Palantir.
Yeah. They're pretty evil. Yeah, that's a we could talk about that. Sorry. All right. Okay. Yep.
Have you seen any change in word shifts that could be explained due to a speeding up of the news cycle? Like, you say an example of that I would think is like, do you see like a quicker change, just the rate of change in like word shift and the way words are used?
I mean,
increase as the news cycle.
Yes, I mean, yes, and I will talk about it in this class. It's this thing that I call chronopathy, right, which is time feel. It's exactly doing that. It's using allotaxonometry, right, so which is adjacent to all of this, right, but it's looking at, it's the because how do you do this, right? This is a hard thing to do, and basically 10 papers went into this, but it's like you've got some big, you can think of topics, but we're just going to do zip distribution of words on one day, a week later, a month later, you've got another zip distribution. Like, what's the churn? How, is it turning, how fast is it turning over? So you can measure those things and see how fast things are speeding up or slowing down. And so, for example, in the middle of the first part of the coronavirus, or COVID, we called it coronavirus at the time, April, 14 days in April then, 2020, felt like 2 or 3 days in all of the years before, right? Because it just ground to a halt, right? So days didn't feel different. People weren't going to school. The news was the same every day. So there was just one giant story, and this is thinking around Trump or the president at the time, really ground to a halt. And then, George Floyd's murder goes crazy again. But then after it slows down again, because now you just sort of have two big stories, and it slowed down again because coronavirus came back in the summer, and it ground to a halt again. And then you had the election, it exploded again. But if you go back to 2017, just unbelievable churn. There's Boy Scouts, there's North Korea with the Rocket Man stuff, then there's Charlottesville, then there are hurricanes. I mean, and I thought all through this is motivating for this work. It's like, if you could ask people, like, what do you think happened tell me what are the big stories in the last 2 weeks? Like, let's figure, just list them. And it got pretty hard because so much happened. So much happened. And you could miss a giant thing. I mean, like, Space Force was a Tuesday in the middle of all this stuff.
It exists to this day.
It's a thing, but it's just like, it just went pop out of nowhere with like a rocket. But Greenland, Trump wanted to buy Greenland. It was just like, that was a story. Like, where does that fit? That was, and that got itself a plenty of talk. Pretty benign and funny. I don't know what, but there's just, when did things happen, and how much happened, and which years are the most sort of boring, if you go long term. I mean, some of the stuff, it's not really published, but 2012 was pretty sleepy, just not a lot happened. You have to be careful with something like Twitter because it's so dominated now by K-pop, which is fine. It's so dominated by K-pop that you have to kind of like,
it's hard to parse everything else.
You have to sort of say, look, I'm going to look at things about chickens, like, I'm just going to do a topic, and within that space, what's happening?
It's just your exchange.
It's just like it's like the ocean or something. It's like you got kind of like back, modulate that part out. It has its own churn. I mean, if you studied the K-pop stuff, which we did, ultra fame.
The internet, or like having social networks that are more connected, like that would also speed up this experience, right? Like more, because if it's an idea of like you feel like more things are happening in a higher rate of time.
Things can be amplified more rapidly.
Right. It's more about your perception. It's not necessarily that more things are actually happening. It's just that you're hearing about more that you think are.
Yeah, but I mean, there are. You can look deeper into it and see which things didn't win. So coronavirus happens. It's the dominant story. It doesn't get beaten by other stories. It doesn't get beaten by other stories. There are lots of other stories, but none of them push it off. So you can see underneath that this churn. Like this, I guess. I know it's.
Yeah, you would want a bunch of mediocre stories to kind of rise. Like they're mediocre.
Yeah, the resting state for Twitter, I think, is celebrities, sports, like what's happening, world soccer, music. It's just like water coolery kind of general talky stuff. That's fine, it's like not scandals, but just like, I love Taylor Swift. Everyone piles on, right? And then it's like, or there's a soccer game, and it's just talked about. It's like, that's the stuff. And then it's like, like North Korea is going to nuke everyone. It's like, and that stuff's still being talked about. Like there's people talking about Ariana Grande, but it gets pushed down. So anyway. What's the resting state of a particular space? Reddit or whatever, or like a school, and what do people sort of just define? There's sort of the idea of just talking about the weather. It's pretty unifying. Yeah. Okay, people. I know. Thank you for letting me do that.
It'd be interesting to see what